Welcome back to the Supply Chain Lab, where we explore people, policies, and possibilities shaping logistics and infrastructure in Africa. Today's episode brings us back to a conversation that we started live at Africa Rail. I had the honor of moderating a panel on ESG performance, and one voice that stood out, not just for her clarity, but for her calm precision and grounded insights, is that of Sanet Smit. Sanet is a principal engineer at Transnet Engineering Research and Development Division, and she's someone who doesn't just talk ESG, but she's helping engineer it into the real world of rail. Sanet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think before we go right into the conversation, it would be great if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and your current role at Transnet.
Well, I had the privileged opportunity to get a bursary for IT studies. So I didn't start out as an engineer. So I finished my studies there and met my husband, and he supported me to actually start engineering studies. And then Transnet came across my way, and I managed to get a bursary from them to complete my engineering studies as well. And being a bursary student, I landed up at technology management at Transnet Freight Rail in a department called electrical technologies. So there I got exposure to substations, OHGE, a lot of electrical equipment. And in about, I think it was around 2019, I volunteered to do a bit of research around hydrogen because it became a buzzword at that point. And I said to my principal engineer at the time, Mr. Sabande, no, give me the opportunity to investigate. And that has led me to have the opportunity to engage group-wide on energy, emergence of energy technology. And subsequently, I have moved to Transnet Engineering, where I now am a principal engineer in a department called Energy and Motion, strangely enough. And we do the technical development for rolling stock and port equipment on propulsion systems and energy efficiency. We also do a lot of consulting throughout Transnet on any energy-related, I would say, matters, but also initiatives. So, for example, smart metering that they're trying to roll out at Transnet properties. We've got Transnet National Ports Authority that's looking into bunkering, for example, hydrogen, alternative fuels, and so forth. So it is quite a nice space to sit in. But as my career progressed, that's how I landed. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's a very interesting story. So, what is your current focus, and what keeps you excited about the work that you're currently doing?
So, look, research and development, when we study as engineers, we really get a lot of technical work and a technical exposure. But once you start working as an engineer, you've got limited actually exposure to technical fields. For me personally, I've got the opportunity every day to go and climb on a locomotive or to go into my lab. We can test equipment. We physically work with a lot of components. And what drives me every day is the opportunity to actually change the country in the end. A small change like improving the efficiency of an auxiliary motor can lead to a lot of savings from an energy perspective across the board, which in turn saves Transnet money from an operational perspective, which then snowballs throughout to the economy. So I think that big picture thinking and understanding that small item we're working on every day can improve it. And then also actually having working POCs, that does make a difference. If you can touch and feel the equipment, that actually makes a difference. And it's not just a research paper or a report. I think for me that drives me well.
I remember in the panel discussion, we spoke about how 80% of emissions are locked in construction when it comes to rail. What does ESG by design actually mean in your space?
So, with my experience at Transnet Freight Rail, a lot of it was with capacity studies, determining, for example, how we could increase the tonnages we run on a specific line without increasing the infrastructure, or what is the minimal infrastructure cost to run more tonnages. So in the rail sector, the balance between being able to run tons on the rail versus the cost of your infrastructure around it, your rolling stock, is quite important. Now, any project has some form of initiation. And for me, looking at ESG by design, it means that from that inception point, you already take into account ESG. And it's not just emissions. You have to consider your social elements. You have to consider your financial impact. If we overinvest in a specific technology and it becomes a burden to future generations to pay that off, we have not succeeded in our ESG target. So apart from just looking at the obvious, the environmental studies, we also have to look at the whole design holistically. So for large scale projects, infrastructure, as well as, for example, big asset projects, your emissions can get generated across the full life cycle of the project, but also of the equipment, operational life of the equipment. Even at the end of life, there is a lot of emissions and environmental impact around that. So if we at the outstart have a full scope and a full view of across the life cycle of this element, be it a project, be it an asset, we can plan for it. We can get alternatives. We can make sure we make the best decision we can. So mainly, if you look at building and infrastructure, you've got scope 2 and 3 emissions throughout your because it's value chain related. But when you actually have, let's say, a new service you want to do in rail, let's say we've got a new mine that opens, we need to look at how we could service that mine. Then you also have to look at scope 1 emissions. Are you going to do an electrified rail? Are you going to do a diesel? And it's not a big element is the cost, but you have to look across the value. If upfront cost, if your capital cost means that you spend lower cost across the operational life, or that your environmental impact is lower, you have to look for that and you have to plan for it. Then also, I think I used somewhere an example of green steel, and green steel is becoming quite a buzzword. If we want to use green steel, for example, to build a locomotive, if we want to build rolling stock for the European market, which has certain criteria for the assets before they buy them, if we buy this green steel, but we ship it via a diesel-powered shipping lane, we basically negate any benefit we would have seen from an emissions perspective and making sure that we adhere to the carbon credits and so forth. So taking into account how you get your materials to site, how do you import it? And also, is it feasible to say something must be locally produced if your volumes doesn't substantiate it? Or if it costs you X amount more than your competitor. So all of those elements need to be taken into account. And then a big thing for us specifically in research and development is having a systems thinking mentality around any project, making sure you understand the concept of how, let's say we've built a product, how will it be used? Who does it interact with? And just have a broader view from the outset, not just focused on the technical viability of the technology. Um, a lot of effort the last few years has gone into hydrogen, but it remains a very dangerous material to use. So any benefit you have to play it off against your capital cost, but also your cost of making sure your employees, your environment, your communities that any sort of rolling stock with that commodity on it passes through is actually taken into account. So I think for me, the design, it's about intent. If you intend to take ESG criteria into account, you will realize it. I think that's, yeah.
I think you touched on some very important points. I like that you brought the green steel in. What other innovations are we going to be seeing in the African context when it comes to rail?
So rail, especially internationally, there is a push towards electrifying rail. Now, in our South African context specifically, we actually are de-electrifying about a third of our rail, and that is due to our vandalism. But also we have to take into account some of those lines are not being utilized as much, the demand on it. So one of the negative factors of the moving over to road has been that we have low volumes on some of our lines. And that has resulted in an increase of vandalism on those lines, because one of the easiest way to prevent vandalism is to have traffic, have constant, movement around the lines. So one of the technologies that is quite developing, it might not be there for freight or heavy freight. It might be more suited to low freight, general freight goods, or in our yards, is battery technologies. However, taking into account, we also have to make sure where it's sourced from. What is the metals going into? Where's those minerals coming from? How are they sourced? Are they ethically sourced? And then what are you going to do once those batteries degrade beyond the capacity required for rail? Are we going to sit with a massive dump of batteries? Is there a way to recover it? Luckily, most of the newer technology of battery chemistries are highly recyclable. But we have to take into account the cost of recycling. There might be also some places we could reuse them. Then one of the easier, I would say, looking towards renewables, ways of incorporating that into rail, is through, if you've got electrified rail, through supplying from renewable sources to your electrified rail. But also to support, you've got supporting functions, you've got your signaling system, which in South Africa, we encountered that with the PRASA systems, where there was a lot of vandalism on the signaling system that led to derailments and accidents that impacted life. If we can convert those systems to use renewables, standalone systems, it just provides another level of security there, but it also brings us into a newer technology. We have, so apart from electrified rail, we have certain cases where diesel just remains much more feasible, because we've got, say, only 3 trains a week. In those sort of cases, you don't want to put all of the infrastructure in. So our mitigating our diesel emissions is a high priority. And that is for the whole of Africa, because diesel locomotives is prevalent. And one of the constraints about improving the efficiency of existing diesels is the technology. You have onboard equipment like electronic systems that control your locomotive. If those are not upgraded with, say, you're going to implement a new filtering system to reduce some of the emissions, or if you want to upgrade your engine from a tier 1 to a tier 3, you need to then have a holistic view of the whole locomotive and then refurbish that and to improve the overall technology. But there is a nice stream of research going on around alternative fuels. So synthetic fuels, e-methanol, um, we have hydrogenated vegetable oil. The biodiesels is very expensive. Diesel as such is about 3 times more expensive than electric rail. If you transport 1 ton by electric rail, it's let's say it's about that would be 3 times as much goes into the cost of running a diesel. So the biodiesel doubles that about. So and in South Africa specifically, we have to look at our food security. We don't want our farmers to now convert to a more valuable crop being biodiesel, and then we create a food security issue. But there is like the hydrogenated vegetable oils, hydrogen-based synthetic fuels that is under development and under research. So I do think that's going to be something that we will see a lot of. And then substituting, hybridizing some of our locomotives. For example, one of the easiest adaptation is to have onboard battery storage with something like a diesel engine, and you convert your brake lines for your complete train into electric braking, whereby you then generate electricity when you brake, and that electricity you can store on your battery banks. The limits around that is about space, and it will depend on your operations, but it is like a midway for us before we can get to that ultimate clean running energy. And then hydrogen is on the far sphere. There's a lot of research going into it, but the feasibility and the cost around it is significant and currently hampering, I would say, even POCs. On freight, there is shunting locos, yes, where POCs have been developed. Passenger rail, yes, it's going well there. But for freight, because of our loading, it's still very early. So I would say that's about 5 to 10 years before we will see something concrete, and can build plans around that.
Okay.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the things that Transnet does is it refurbishes thousands of wagons. So over and above what you've just touched on, how does this fit into the broader sustainable kind of thinking
So
process?
yes, so the nice thing about wagons is it's lining that gets deteriorated, but your underframe systems can go through quite a lot of cycles. So something like a 2 million kilometer cycle is not unheard of. It's actually quite frequent to hear something like that. What we have realized is our rolling stock, our locomotives specifically, a lot of them are aging. They're about 40 to 70 years old, but their underframes are still about only 50 to 20%, 20 to 50% of lifetime use. So they could go a lot further. So a big thing about reusing and refurbishment is identifying where we can reuse that, when it is viable to reuse it, and also then to repurpose. Say a locomotive that 10 years, maybe more, 20 years ago, it was strong enough to pull mainline freight, but because we increase our tonnages, our axle loading is increased, we're pushing for longer, heavier trains. Those locomotives might not be suitable for mainline operation, but we can still do something like a sideline, maybe from the pit to a yard where you can assemble, or you can use them at the at the yards where we assemble a full train. So having a look holistically on what we've got available, and how we could refurbish them is very important. And then if we look at our infrastructure, our existing rail infrastructure, we've got some of the oldest 3 kV DC systems in the world. We also run the heaviest trains on a DC system. So using the infrastructure to its maximum. We run 100 wagons on a DC system, which if you go to Europe, you will not see it. So the DC systems is for passenger rails. They're all converting to AC systems, which is a 25 kV AC, which is starting to become a norm. So I think one of the items we really need to research into is how do we merge from that old infrastructure to a newer infrastructure that's more suited for heavy freight and moving volumes. One of the main benefits between AC and DC, DC requires a lot of copper. It's a lower voltage, so it's copper intensive. It's also a target for theft. AC lines, less copper because it's high voltage, so you need less copper. We see a bit less vandalism and theft on those lines. So there's a lot of benefits, but there is, it's not just looking at that one element, because now we have to look at bridges, tunnels. There's a lot of ecosystem impacts into it. Lines and supplies that were set up for Transnet back when they were constructing them was done solely for Transnet. In the meantime, business as economy has evolved. There's mines that opened, there's industry that opened that wasn't there before. So we need to look holistically, how do we evolve those locations and those regional areas into a better transport hub? And we have a lot of opportunity for that.
And
I
so
went a bit offline.
no, it's okay. No, I mean, it's good information. But where would you say, what do you predict are going to be the circular practices within rail? Obviously, given the fact that rail actually emits much less than road transportation, what do you think is realistic for South Africa right now?
I would say it would be to take our current rolling stock, our current infrastructure. So on a rolling stock perspective, it would be to upgrade certain systems we've got control over. Your control systems, your train authorization systems. I wouldn't say we need to buy as much new locomotives as reported. I would think it would be more of a refurbishment of the older rolling stock. Worldwide, there's a push towards sweating rolling stock more. We are in the position that we have an older fleet that's not in use that we can use. So investment in that, and then I think there's a lot of communication from Transnet Group about privatizing certain elements, and it's not privatizing; it's public-private partnerships. For example, we've got sections, as I said, that's got a low loading, so only 3 trains a week. Making, for example, leasing out or concessioning those sections out to private sector to run and operate, so that we as Transnet can focus more on our main lines, on our revenue generating backbones. That I feel is something that's going to feature a lot. And circular economy, it is to do the best with what you have, and to not just be wasteful, but to see how we could reuse something and repurpose it. We've got a lot of land. We've got a lot of, I would say we're the second largest property owner in the country, second only to the government, and there is opportunity within that. So to optimally utilize that and to integrate with the rest of, especially our supply chains, if we can incorporate it more with our mining sector and at the ports with the exporters. I would say that is where I would see it going.
So, Sanet, I know we've spoken quite a bit on the environmental part of ESG, which I think is what most of the focus is when people talk about ESG. But I think we should also just touch on the social, the social part of ESG and what role communities play and how you can bring them in. Will that help maybe with vandalism? Will it not? Let's just chat a little bit about the social, the S in ESG.
Yes, and it's our context, it's our environment. We operate in it. Um, we need to have a look at how we impact the lives of an average South African. And one of the I know in KZN we've got quite a few places where we provide, for example, power because we've got this infrastructure that's powering the rail. We provide power to certain of the community centers in the areas. And engaging with those communities, it gives them ownership, basically, and pride to look after the infrastructure close to them. Because if there is vandalism on the line, it impacts them also. So getting that sort of buy-in, but also if we start a project and we're going to do an infrastructure project, to get some input from the community. It might be that there's a specific road or there's a specific condition currently that is a pain point for the community and they feel undervalued if we are not engaging them on it. For example, on the iron ore line, there's sections where we have to switch off community power for 2 or 3 days when Eskom has to switch over a feed or put a new line in, and it has a massive impact. From a social perspective, if we can be more human and then mitigate the impact, acknowledge you're impacting someone's life. If they don't have power for that section, make sure that you provide some form of comfort to the community or try and find out how to minimize the impact. Even access roads, those sort of thing. Um, we have a railroad and a network set out long before any communities was taken into account. If you now in the current day and with our current policies want to establish a railroad, you have to do an impact study. You have to get buy-in from your communities. And I think that's an element we can improve on to go and look at, listen, we already have this infrastructure. How can we improve our impact to the community? Um, and it is good governance and it's good, I would say, just being human to account for that. I think one of the good things that Transnet also tries to do to get community buy-in is the Pela Pepa train. So we've got 2 train sets that for about 8 months out of the year travel the whole country with a set of doctors and dentists and optometrists, and they provide in conjunction with the healthcare department treatment to communities that doesn't have access to cities. And I feel it shows the benefit of a rail. It gives you access to people and it provides access to people. Um, so I would like to see more of that. I feel like that's definitely something we can improve. Not just as Transnet, but as government projects, for example, is to take that into account. How can we use our existing infrastructure to reach more people?
I like the points you've made, Sanet. So I know one of the things that takes most organizations off ESG is the cost of actually investing in becoming more sustainable or more environmentally friendly. How do you think companies can look past this, or they can take like a long-term kind of view, around ESG?
I think it comes around also communicating what is the benefits of ESG, because technically ESG has a fourth element that looks at economic or financial stability and sustainability as well. So if you apply your ESG goals and principles correctly, it means your business will be sustainable long term. You're not going to face, for example, penalties from government because of toxic spills. Those risks, technically, your ESG strategy is supposed to reduce those amounts of risk. So, from an investor perspective, it enables your business or your corporation to look more investable and long-term feasible if you do it correctly, or if you follow some of the nice principles that's coming out. Um, but down to the cost, I do think there was an initial reaction to just add a ESG or emissions element to any procurement event without thinking it through. So one of the approaches we've taken in some projects is to look at the full life cycle cost of a product rather than just the initial capital cost, because then building your business case becomes much more based in fact. And I think sound governance principles feed into that. So your G part of your ESG helps with you being financially stable. It also helps that you invest correctly. Um, but there is high level conversion costs that are difficult. For example, if we had to today remove diesel completely from our operationals, we wouldn't be able to. The cost of converting to an alternative fuel is too high. We would then have to take on a huge amount of debt that would become generational debt for the country. So I would say doing our due diligence to say what is our alternatives to it. But there is examples like the solar adaptation of solar technology, where we've seen that as the technology progresses, it becomes cheaper. So um, we do see wind and so forth as well, but we haven't seen as much reduction in the cost to ownership in that. But to look at maturity levels of technology as well, to not just say, okay, you know, as much as we a government function, um, we can't take on the cost of developing the technology, but we can take on the cost of adapting once it's proven and the full benefits has been proven. So I think that sort of distinction, it just shows that we are a bit more conscious of our effect and the costs. Um, I do think there is a lot to be said for value and benefit realization. Um, if we can go with the onset to say, how do we quantify your benefits from your ESG goals, for example, and how do we relate it to the value we're willing to expend on them, and that sort of thing, so that we can provide a proper value proposition when going to ask for amount of money to invest in something. And I think also having the data to show it, and um, basing it on concrete or concrete values, and not just on, listen, uh, everyone is pushing into this direction. For example, with the hydrogen, there is a hype. It's not about following the hype. It is by making sure it is actually value, or yeah, value for our money and for our investment.
Yeah, I like what you're saying with regards to us just testing the viability within the environment that we're in and not just following whatever the trends are. But what are your views around ESG linked finance, and how, like, will this motivate more organizations, or could it assist in getting some of the projects over the line?
I do think so. We have on our side, we're looking into grant funding for quite a few projects, and we were very politely told, it it must not contain any diesel related projects, it must be relatable to a green or a renewable outcome. And it has pushed the evaluation on our internal side on how do we choose different projects to initiate towards that. So yes, it will definitely, that the funding, especially the international funding and how they connect it to our ESG is improving, I would say, the due diligence on choosing projects and also making sure that the benefits are there. The financing as such, because we depend heavily on government funding as well, there is an amount of accountability that improves. So green funding in essence has pushed that accountability a bit further. But overall, I don't think that there is anything fundamentally wrong with associating certain values to your funding. From a grant perspective, it ensures that it goes to a responsible cause, and I think that that is quite motivational.
Yeah, I agree. So I know there's a lot of ESG fatigue because there's so many different types of ways of reporting, and there isn't like any standardized way. What helps you and your team stay accountable and ensure that you're not drowning in the admin of trying to report on, your impact?
So luckily, I've got limited reporting fatigue that directly comes to me. Being in a big organization, luckily the load is spread well. For me personally, is getting new challenges. Reporting on our fuel consumption, there's some technical things that come out that has enabled us to identify, listen, we can go do a project on how we can improve our reporting on our actual diesel consumption versus what we are buying. So there is these elements of technical interest that we pull out from it. One thing I must say, our ESG report that's coming out for this financial year, Transnet has really put in a lot of effort. It is the first time it's going to be in this format, and just seeing the first draft the other day it was worth it. You're like, okay, we can see there's even in the reporting function and the output of the report, there is movement. I think one of the other elements is actually getting the grant funding. You know, it means that all of that effort that went into, someone has felt that we are putting enough effort into our ESG reporting to offer us funding to continue on with projects in this space. So I feel like that is the benefit I can pull from it, my team can pull from it. But it depends on where you're sitting and what you're reporting on. I do think also it enables us to identify gaps for where there is potential to improve. But we are lucky that our colleagues from Transnet Group that's pushing it is not looking for it to be a stick to say, listen, you guys are not doing your work, but as an opportunity identification tool. And I think that attitude on how we approach it has definitely helped so that it doesn't become this fatiguing process of constantly delivering data and going through the data and reporting and so forth.
I like that. I know governance is something we haven't really touched on. What are your thoughts around some of the policies that are supposed to support, obviously, making organizations more sustainable, or ESG? What policy would you say maybe needs to be redesigned to kind of support some of the initiatives that you're seeing within the rail sector?
So, look, for us in the rail sector, I think one of the fundamental policies that came out was the green freight or the green transport strategy. Prior to that, it was the white paper on rail reform. and on rail strategy. These papers in the last 5 years have given a lot more input into strategy around what we do. So prior to that, we were quite limited in seeing a future vision, overall vision. Um, I do think that there needs to be a bit more breakdown into further concrete, let's say per commodity export or per corridor, what sort of localized strategy we can develop as a country to incorporate not just the rail, but the full freight from your source all the way down to your export point. Um, while the road the green transport policy covers quite a lot in essence. Um, I feel like we need to now take it a bit deeper, go more into depth per corridor, per, let's say, commodity, and also per region, um, to actually impact it. And also around the sustainability, what is the definition of sustainability for these sort of corridors? Do we want them to remain indefinitely? Is there a 20 or 30-year horizon for extracting minerals in a certain region, and we then need to recuperate that infrastructure and redeploy it somewhere else? That sort of thing, to look a bit more holistically. How do we use our infrastructure for the benefit of the whole country, rather than, let's say, we want the infrastructure to look like, specifically. Um, I think that is in a global perspective, or in a greater South African perspective. For us, as for example Transnet, we would need to know what is our core mandates, for example. Drill those a bit down more. Um, and we've got our mandates, and our C's got a mandate from Minister of Transport, but how do we drill down that to regions or to support functions in each section, um, to make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction and the same growth, so that we don't get blindsided. Once the coal is not being exported anymore, what are we going to do with that infrastructure and that section of the country?
Yeah, I like what you're saying with regards to policy. I think this is a policy-wide problem in South Africa, in where it's quite broad. It's quite broad, and it's very difficult to kind of see how you can use it like every day. So I do agree with that. So what is one idea or principle you'd like every young African engineer to hold on to, especially around ESG within the rail sector?
So for me, it is the fact that we impact every day, whether you're doing something small or big, you're impacting the economy of South Africa. You're impacting the lives of every single South African. If we can all pull together, we have the ability to improve the country as a whole, and everybody is valuable. Whether it's the person cleaning the offices or the engineer making the design decisions, every single one of us is important. We've got a role to play, and we can get there. Um, for engineers specifically, South African engineering is very strong. We are sought after engineers, but remember, we are South African. I don't want to say we owe it to the country, but we should be giving back. I feel like we should be proudly South African, um, and learn what we can from the international sector, but always bring it home. Um, there is really, from an engineering perspective, no other country that's the same. We've got unique challenges, but we also have, um, quite a lot of solutions that's not existent anywhere else. So take that, take what you can learn, but always look back and see if you cannot improve it for South Africa as a whole.
Okay. Sanet, I think we've reached the end. I don't know if there's anything else around ESG and the rail sector that you think is critical that I haven't touched on, that you think everybody should know.
I do think maybe just in general, it's to note that the rail sector is a slow moving, slow changing uh, sector. And it is, I would say we need patience, but we shouldn't be lax in enacting change. Um, we are the backbone of the economy. And the sooner we can enact change and improve on our rail performance, the sooner we can see a improvement in the overall GDP of the country. So I would say do not underestimate the importance of rail for the country.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Sanet. Thank you so much for your time.
No,
We really,
pleasure.
really appreciate you making time to chat to me. We will chat soon. That brings us
Oh,
to the end
thank
of
you
our
very much.
interview.
Thank you very much.